The trays were already stacked when the sun came up. Bernice Mae Hayes had been doing it this way for 19 years. She arrived at Jefferson Elementary at 6:15 every morning, 90 minutes before the first bus pulled into the loop, because the lunch service did not run itself, and because running it correctly required preparation that most people never saw and never thought about. She moved through the kitchen the way she had learned to move in the Army, with economy, with purpose, with the particular kind of attention that comes from understanding that every action has a downstream consequence, and that getting it right the first time is always faster than correcting it later. She was 63 years old. Her hair was silver-streaked, and she kept it in a tight braid that sat against the back of her neck like a cable. Her hands were the hands of someone who had worked with them her entire life, broad-palmed, precise, calloused at the points that mattered. She stood 5'7" and wore her hairnet and her apron with the same quiet authority that other people wore. A uniform which was because she understood that what you wore to work was a statement about what you thought the work was worth. The kitchen smelled of warming soup and industrial cleaner, and the particular sweetness of bread rolls in the oven, and Bernice moved through it without thinking about the smell, because after 19 years, the kitchen was part of her body. She knew where everything was in the dark. She knew which shelf liner would need replacing by Thursday, and which of the 2 ovens ran 7 degrees hotter than it was set to, and which of her 3 prep staff arrived sharp, and which one needed 2 cups of coffee before she was fully operational. She knew because she paid attention, and because paying attention was as far as she had ever been able to determine the entire job. She had cooked for the United States Army for 10 years. She had enlisted at 22 the year her father died and left her mother with 3 younger siblings and a mortgage that was 3 months behind. She had not enlisted because it was her dream. She had enlisted because it was the most direct route she could find from the situation she was in to a situation that was better. The Army had given her structure and training and 10 years of learning what she was made of under conditions that did not ask her permission before revealing it. She had run the mess kitchen at Fort Benning first, then at a base in Germany, then at a forward operating base outside Kandahar in 2003, where the hours were 22 and the supplies were uncertain, and the men and women who ate what she prepared needed it to be correct because they were doing things that required every resource they had. She had fed 400 soldiers during a rotation when the refrigeration unit failed, and she had 3 hours to adapt the entire menu using what was shelf-stable, and she had done it without losing a single meal and without anyone eating something they should not have eaten. Her commanding officer had come to the mess that evening and stood in the doorway and watched the soldiers eat and had said, "Sergeant Hayes, you could have panicked." She had said, "I don't have time to panic, sir. I have 400 people to feed." He had said, "That's what I thought." She had left the Army at 32 with a sergeant's rank and an honorable discharge and 2 commendations and the specific kind of competence that cannot be taught except by doing the thing under pressure enough times that the pressure becomes unremarkable. She had run a catering business for 5 years. Small events, church suppers, school fundraisers. The occasional wedding before the Jefferson Elementary position had been advertised, and she had applied and been hired immediately, because the interview committee had never before encountered someone who could recite from memory the USDA nutritional requirements for K-12 lunch programs and then describe in practical terms how to meet them within a budget that had not been updated since 2009. She had the same 400 people to feed now, more or less. They were smaller. Their requirements were different. No nut products for Marcus in 3rd grade, no gluten for Precious in 5th soft foods on Tuesdays for the boy in 1st grade who had come back from his dental surgery still tender. She had learned all of it without being asked to write it down, because writing it down meant consulting the paper when the information was needed, and Bernice had not needed to consult anything external in a long time. She had built this cafeteria program over 19 years. When she arrived, Jefferson Elementary had the lowest lunch participation rate in the district, 53%, which meant nearly half the children were not eating during the school day. She had read the data and then she had done what she had always done when confronted with a problem. She had gone to the source. She had sat in the cafeteria for 3 days during lunch, watching what children chose and what they left and what expressions they wore when they looked at their trays. She had watched, and she had concluded that the problem was not hunger, which was real, and was not indifference, which was not real. The problem was that the food was not good enough to compete with whatever the children had been told they could do instead. She had changed the menus. This had required approval from the district's food services director, which she had gotten. It had required negotiating new supply contracts, which she had done herself over 3 years and across 2 superintendents, because the supply contracts were attached to the old menus, and changing the menus without changing the contracts produced nothing. It had required training her staff in new preparations, which meant longer prep times, which meant arriving earlier, which she did. She had introduced a rotating special that changed weekly. She researched what the students were studying in their social studies classes and designed the special accordingly. The week they studied West African kingdoms, she served jollof rice. The week they studied Japan miso soup, small portions. Introductions. The children who were curious ate the special. The children who were not curious watched the children who were curious eat it, and some of them changed their minds. By the end of the 2nd year, the rotating special had its own small following of regulars who asked her on Monday mornings what the special would be that week. Participation was now 91%. She did not think of this as her achievement. She thought of it as the job done correctly. The achievement belonged to the children who ate and learned and grew. It belonged to Rosa Gutierrez and her other staff who had adapted their prep to serve the new menus without complaint. It belonged to the parents who had signed the feedback forms she sent home each semester and who had written comments that she read carefully and filed and sometimes used. It belonged to the process of paying attention to the right things and being willing to do the work that the right things required. On the far wall above the service counter, the cafeteria's security camera had been mounted 4 years ago by the district's facilities team. It captured the service line and most of the seating area. It had been recording continuously since installation. On the far wall above the service counter, the cafeteria's security camera had been mounted 4 years ago by the district's facilities team after a string of lunchroom incidents at schools across the county. It was a standard wide-angle unit that captured the full service line and most of the seating area. Bernice had noted it when it went up and had thought good. She ran a clean kitchen and a clean operation, and she had nothing to object to in being observed. The camera had been running continuously since installation. She had never once thought about it as anything other than furniture. On the far wall above the service counter, the cafeteria's security camera had been mounted 4 years ago, following a string of lunchroom incidents at schools across the county. It was a wide-angle unit with a clear line of sight to the service line and most of the seating area. The district's facilities team had installed it without much ceremony and without much discussion. Bernice had noted it going up and had thought good. She had never thought about it again. The first indication something was off had come 2 weeks before the Wednesday incident. Webb had been to the cafeteria twice, once to speak with Bernice about a vague report of a supply discrepancy, once to observe the lunch service in a way that felt less like supervision and more like inspection. Both times Bernice had offered to pull records. Both times he had declined. She had noted this and filed it alongside the other things she had noted and filed about Webb in the preceding 18 months, which formed a small but coherent picture of a person who was looking for a way in rather than a problem to solve. She had mentioned it to Rosa. Rosa had said, "What are you going to do?" Bernice had said, "I'm going to keep my records clean, and my kitchen clean, and my head down, and hope he finds something more interesting elsewhere." Rosa had said, "And if he doesn't?" Bernice had said, "Then I'll deal with whatever he brings." She had not known it would be this. At 11:45 on a Wednesday in March, when the first lunch wave arrived and the cafeteria filled with the particular beautiful noise of 400 children eating together, Officer Dale Webb walked in through the side door. He was 32. He was District Resource Officer for the Jefferson Elementary Zone, which was a position that had been created 7 years ago as part of a community safety initiative, and that had produced, in Webb's specific case, 3 formal complaints from school staff in 18 months. The first complaint had come from a custodian who had said Webb questioned why he was in the building when he was clearly in uniform with a mop in his hands. The second had come from an aide who said Webb had demanded to know her authorization to be in a restricted classroom. The third had come from the previous cafeteria manager who had retired the following month and who, when asked by a colleague whether the incident had anything to do with her retirement, had said only, "I have enough years in." All 3 complaints had been reviewed individually and closed without action. No one had read them as a pattern. Webb walked into the cafeteria with the particular bearing of someone who was not fully comfortable with authority and compensated by performing it loudly. He was thick-necked, pale-complexioned, with close-cropped hair and the expression of someone who had decided in advance how the interaction was going to go. Webb had been assigned to Jefferson Elementary 18 months ago. In those 18 months, he had generated 3 formal complaints from school staff and 0 documented positive interactions that any staff member could recall. He had attended 2 community meetings and had contributed nothing substantive to either. He had written 17 incident reports, 12 of which had been found to require no action upon review. He had a way of moving through the building that felt less like presence and more like surveillance. Not the protective kind, the extractive kind. The kind that is looking for something to act on rather than something to prevent. Bernice Hayes had crossed paths with him 4 times before the Wednesday in March. Each time she had said good morning, and he had not replied. She had noted this and filed it under the category of things that were not her problem until they were. He walked to the service counter where Bernice was directing the line. He said, "I need to talk to you." Bernice looked at him. She had seen the type before, not in this building specifically, but in the world, which was large enough to have produced many of the same type. She recognized the performance. She recognized what it was covering. She set down the serving spoon she was holding and gave him her full attention. She said, "I'm in the middle of lunch service. What do you need?" He said, "I've received a report that supplies have been going missing from this kitchen." The noise of 400 children continued around them. Several of the children near the front of the line had paused to look. One of the cafeteria aides, a woman named Rosa Gutierrez, who had worked with Bernice for 6 years, looked up from the soup station with an expression Bernice recognized as the beginning of alarm. Bernice said, "I run this inventory myself. I can show you the records this afternoon." He said, "I need to see them now." She said, "I will be with you at 12:30 when the first wave is finished. I have 400 children in lunch service right now." He said, "That's not how this works." Bernice Hayes had fed soldiers in a forward operating base outside Kandahar under conditions that would have broken most people. She had rebuilt a cafeteria program from 53% participation to 91%. She had done all of this by knowing exactly what the work required and by not being moved from what the work required by anything that was less important than the work. She said, "Officer, I will speak with you at 12:30. I would be grateful if you would wait in the front office." He did not move toward the front office. He said, "I'm not going to the front office. I'm staying here." She looked at him for a moment, not with anger and not with fear, but with the specific clarity of someone who has assessed a situation and determined what it actually is. She picked up her serving spoon and went back to the line. Rosa Gutierrez watched. She had her phone in her apron pocket, which she was not supposed to have on the floor, but which she always had on the floor because she was a mother and mothers kept their phones accessible. She did not take it out. She watched. In the third section of seating at a table near the window with 5 of her classmates, 11-year-old Amara Jackson watched Officer Webb standing at the service counter and watched Ms. Hayes serving the line, and understood with the specific clarity that children sometimes possess, and that adults often credit to instinct. But that is in fact a form of careful observation that something was happening that was not right. Webb stood at the service counter for 11 minutes. He watched Bernice work. He did not find what he was watching for, which was a woman who was frightened or diminished or uncertain. He found instead a woman who served 400 children with precision and with the particular warmth of someone who has been doing this work for 19 years and who considers it worthy of her full self. This was not what he had expected to find. It made him angrier. At 12:14, when the first wave was nearly through the line, he stepped around the counter and into the service area. Bernice said, "Officer, this is a food preparation area. You need to stay on the public side." He said, "I'm investigating a report." She said, "You need a hairnet and gloves to be on this side of the counter. Those are the rules." He said, "I don't need a hairnet." She said, "The health code requires it." He said, "Get out from behind the counter. I need to speak with you in the hall." He stepped closer. He was 3 inches taller than her, and he used those 3 inches the way some people use height as a claim. He put his hand on her arm. Bernice Hayes went very still. She had a rule that she had carried from the Army, which was that you do not raise your voice and you do not show alarm, and you do not give the other person the reaction they are trying to produce, because the reaction they are trying to produce is the only leverage they have. She had been in situations in the Army that required this rule, and she had applied it. She applied it now. She went still and she looked at his hand on her arm and she said, "Remove your hand." He did not remove his hand. He said, "You're coming with me." Rosa Gutierrez at the soup station took out her phone. She had decided in the first 30 seconds of Webb's presence in the cafeteria that she was going to film whatever happened. She had made this decision not because she had been told to, but because she had 6 years of working alongside Bernice Hayes, and she understood, watching Webb at the service counter, that this was a situation where what happened and what would later be said to have happened were going to be different unless something created a record of what actually happened. She was an aide and not a supervisor, and she had a phone in her pocket that she was not supposed to have on the floor, and she was going to use it. She filmed 17 seconds before Bernice was turned toward the hall. In those 17 seconds, the cafeteria camera above the service counter captured everything. The approach, the arm, the stillness, the instruction to remove the hand, the non-compliance from an angle that left nothing ambiguous. He walked her toward the side door. Bernice Hayes walked. She did not resist. She did not speak loudly. She walked the way she had walked in the Army when the situation required you to move through something you had not chosen to move through, with your head level and your eyes forward, and the full weight of who you were behind every step. The posture of someone who has not been defeated, regardless of what the moment looks like from the outside. She thought as she walked about the inventory. She thought about the delivery receipts filed in the cabinet in the back office, each one signed and dated, 19 years of them, a record that was clean because she had kept it clean. She thought about the camera above the service counter, which had been running for 4 years. She thought about what her sergeant had told her. The facts will be loud enough. You just need to make sure the facts are in the room. The facts were in the room. They had been in the room for 19 years. She needed 5 more days to get them in front of the right people. She did not feel afraid. She felt the specific heaviness of a person who is being required to do something they should not have to do, and who is doing it anyway because doing it correctly is the only way through. She had felt this before. She knew what it weighed. She knew it was temporary. At the door to the hall, she stopped walking. She turned around. She looked at the cafeteria, at 400 children who had fallen into a silence that only a school cafeteria can produce, the specific silence of children who understand that something serious is happening to someone they know and who do not know what to do with that understanding. She looked at them all. She said clearly in a voice that carried across the room without rising, she said, "Finish your lunches. Everything is going to be fine." Then she walked into the hall. In the third section of seating at the table near the window, Amara Jackson looked at the tray in front of her. She looked at the door that had closed behind Ms. Hayes. She looked at her tray again. She did not eat. Webb put Bernice Hayes in handcuffs at 12:19 in the hallway outside the cafeteria. A passing teacher, a 4th grade teacher named Mr. Osei, who had been at Jefferson for 9 years, saw it happen and stood frozen in the hallway with a stack of papers in his hand and the particular expression of someone who is watching something that should not be happening and who is calculating in real time what power they have to stop it. The handcuffs were tight. Bernice noted this without reacting to it. She noted the time on the clock on the hallway wall, 12:19. She noted the teacher in the hallway with the papers. She noted the camera at the end of the hall, another district security camera, this one installed 2 years ago. She noted everything with the methodical attention of someone who has learned that what you observe in the moment is what you will need later. Webb said, "You're being detained for questioning related to theft of district property." She said, "I would like to contact my union representative." He said, "You'll have that opportunity." She said, "I would like to contact my union representative now." He did not acknowledge this. He walked her toward the front entrance of the school. Mr. Osei had not moved from the hallway. He stood with his papers and watched and calculated and found that his calculation was insufficient. He did not have enough authority to stop what was happening, and he knew it, and the knowing was the particular helplessness of a person who is witnessing an injustice and who has not yet found the lever that will address it. He held his papers. He watched. He remembered. Dr. Angela Moore, principal of Jefferson Elementary, came out of her office at 12:22. She had been alerted by her administrative assistant the moment Rosa Gutierrez had come through the office door. Rosa had come in still wearing her apron, which she never did, and had said 5 words. "Something is happening to Ms. Hayes." Dr. Moore had been out of her chair before Rosa finished the sentence. She was 51 years old and had been principal of Jefferson Elementary for 7 years. Before that, she had been a vice principal for 4 years and a classroom teacher for 11 years and a student at a school much like Jefferson Elementary for 12 years. Before that, which meant she had spent most of her life inside school buildings and understood them the way you understand a language you were born into. Not as a system, but as a living thing with its own specific rhythms and pressures and moments of crisis. She had the specific bearing of a person who has authority in a building and who has chosen to use that authority in a way that serves the building rather than protecting the person who holds it. She saw Bernice Hayes in handcuffs in the front corridor. She said, "Officer Webb, what is happening?" He said, "I'm detaining Ms. Hayes as part of an investigation." She said, "On what basis?" He said, "Report of theft from district property, multiple instances." She said, "I want to see the report." He said, "You'll receive a copy through the appropriate channels." She said, "This is my school. I want to see the report now." He looked at her the way he had looked at Bernice, with the assessment of someone who was deciding how much authority the person across from him actually had, and whether he needed to comply with it. He decided incorrectly that he did not. He said, "You'll receive a copy through the appropriate channels." Dr. Moore watched him walk Bernice Hayes out the front door of Jefferson Elementary. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went to her office and closed the door and made 3 phone calls, one to the district's human resources director, one to the superintendent's office, and one to the union representative for cafeteria staff. The union representative, a woman named Dolores Reyes, who had been doing this work for 14 years and who had seen most of what there was to see, said, "I'm on my way." Dolores Reyes arrived at the district offices where Bernice had been taken at 1:15. She reviewed what had happened with Bernice and reviewed the incident report that Webb had filed. The report stated that Bernice Hayes had become hostile and aggressive when questioned about missing supplies, had refused to cooperate with the investigation, and had created a disturbance in the cafeteria that disrupted the student lunch period. The report stated that Webb had acted in the interest of maintaining order and protecting the integrity of the investigation. Dolores Reyes was a woman who had read many incident reports and who had developed over 14 years a precise sense of what they were and what they were not. She read Webb's report twice. She said, "This is going to be fine. The inventories will clear you. We'll request the camera footage." This was the false hope. The district superintendent, a man named Roger Halverson, who had been in the position for 2 years, and who was facing a budget review that he did not want complicated by personnel disputes, reviewed the situation at 2:30 that afternoon. He suspended Bernice Hayes pending a district review board hearing, which would be held in 5 days. He also authorized his office to begin a review of Bernice's pension eligibility, citing a procedural clause that had never been used in the history of the district, but that technically existed. Dolores Reyes received notification of the pension review at 3:45. She sat with the notification for a moment. Then she called Bernice. She said, "They're moving to review your pension." Bernice was at home. She had been sitting at her kitchen table since arriving home at 2 o'clock, not because she could not stand, but because she had learned long ago that some situations required you to sit and think before you could stand and act. She was thinking about the 19 years and the 400 children, and the inventory that was correct, and the camera above the service counter that had been running for 4 years. She said, "How long do we have?" Dolores said, "The review board hearing is in 5 days." Bernice said, "I want the camera footage from the cafeteria camera and the hallway camera both." Dolores said, "We've already requested it." Bernice said, "I want to know when we have it." She said, "I'll call you as soon as it comes in." She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table. She thought about the voice she had used when she turned around at the cafeteria door and told 400 children to finish their lunches. She thought about whether they had. At Jefferson Elementary in the cafeteria, 400 children had not finished their lunches. The second lunch wave had come in at 12:30 as scheduled. They found the tables from the first wave still occupied. They found 387 children sitting in front of their food, which had gone cold with their trays untouched. The noise that the cafeteria usually produced at full capacity, the beautiful noise that Bernice Hayes had considered one of the indicators that the program was working, was not present. The cafeteria was nearly silent. The cafeteria aide, Rosa Gutierrez, had not told anyone to stay. She had not organized anything. She had simply gone back to the soup station and watched. The children had stayed on their own. Amara Jackson was still at the table near the window. She had not touched her tray. She had looked at the cold food in front of her for a moment, and she had thought about Ms. Hayes at the service counter, and the way she always said good morning to each student by name, and the way she remembered that Amara liked the vegetable option, and that Marcus from 3rd grade couldn't have nuts, and that the boy in 1st grade needed soft foods on Tuesdays. She had thought about all of this, and she had made a decision. She turned to the girl next to her and said something quietly. That girl turned to the next person. Within 7 minutes of Ms. Hayes being walked out of the cafeteria, the decision had moved through the first wave by a chain of 11-year-old communication that operated faster and more efficiently than any adult system in the building. They were not going to eat. Not today. Not without Ms. Hayes. Amara was in 5th grade and was the president of the student council, which was a position that had previously been considered largely ceremonial. She had taken it seriously in a way that had surprised her teachers, and not surprised anyone who had watched her operate in the cafeteria, where she organized the table rotation during lunch to ensure that students from different grades mixed rather than clustering, which had been her own idea, and which had required her to convince both the cafeteria staff and the social studies teacher who monitored the lunch period. She had the specific quality of someone who does not wait for permission to organize a thing that needs organizing. She did not send any messages. She did not post anything. She simply stayed at her table, and the decision spread around her, and 400 children sat with cold food in front of them and did not eat. A teacher tried to get them to eat. She came to Amara's table and explained that not eating was not going to help Ms. Hayes, and that the best thing they could do was eat their lunch and trust that the adults would handle it. Amara looked at her and said politely, "We're not hungry." The teacher looked at the table. The table was not hungry. She moved to the next table. The next table was also not hungry. She went through 4 tables and then she stopped. Several other teachers tried. Mr. Osei, who was still holding his stack of papers and who had watched Bernice Hayes be walked to the front door, and who knew what he had seen, tried once and then did not try again, because he understood what the children were doing and understood that trying to stop it was not appropriate to the situation. Dr. Moore, who had come to the cafeteria at 12:30 when she realized what was happening, did not try. She looked at 387 children sitting in silence with cold trays in front of them, and she understood what they were doing, and she understood that it was right, and she stood at the back of the cafeteria and watched. The second wave of children who had arrived for their lunch period took one look at the cafeteria and sat down. They did not eat either. A parent volunteer who was in the building that afternoon saw what was happening and filmed it on her phone. The video showed the cafeteria at full capacity, 400 children. Some of the older ones sitting very still. Some of the younger ones fidgeting, but following the lead of the older ones with 400 trays of uneaten food in front of them in near silence in the middle of the school day. She posted the video to the Jefferson Elementary parent group at 1:15. By 3:30, it had been viewed 22,000 times. By the following morning, it would be on 3 national news outlets. The caption she had written said, "These kids won't eat until Ms. Bernice comes back." Bernice Hayes did not see the video that evening. She was at her kitchen table reviewing the inventory documents she had printed from home, which showed 19 years of clean records. Not a single discrepancy, not a single unaccounted delivery, not a single month where what came in did not match what was served. She had maintained the inventory with the same precision she had maintained the mess records in the Army, because she had learned in the Army that the records were not bureaucracy. They were evidence of the work done correctly, and someday you might need that evidence. She was building the case with the same methodical attention she had brought to the cafeteria for 19 years. She made columns. She made notes. She annotated the delivery receipts with dates and signatures and cross-referenced them to the district's purchasing records, which she also had access to because she had been the one managing the supply contracts for 11 years. She was making a list of what she had and what she needed, and she was finding that she had considerably more than she needed. She was 63 years old, and she had spent 4 decades learning that the people who win the quiet fights are not the people who are loudest, but the people who are most prepared. She was prepared. She had been prepared for 19 years, though she had not known she was preparing for this. She thought about the children. She thought about the inventory records and the camera footage that Dolores had requested and the hearing that was 5 days away. She thought about the pension review, which was the part of the situation that was genuinely frightening not for herself, though it was frightening for herself too, but for the category of action it represented, which was the use of the most vulnerable part of a person's situation as leverage. She thought about who decided to do that and when, and what kind of person looks at a 63-year-old cafeteria worker with 19 years of service and decides that threatening her pension is the appropriate response to an officer's unsubstantiated complaint. She thought about it for a long time, then she went to bed. She was 63 years old, and she had seen enough of the world to know that the truth was not self-presenting. The truth required documentation and witnesses and the right people in the right room at the right moment. She was going to make sure all of those things were in place. She visited her mother the second day of the suspension. Her mother was 91 and lived in an assisted living facility on the east side, 15 minutes from Bernice's house. She had lived there for 4 years and had adapted to it with the pragmatic acceptance of someone who has lived long enough to understand that adaptation is usually wiser than resistance. She was small and sharp-eyed, and she had raised 4 children as a single mother after Bernice's father died when Bernice was 12, and she had done this by working 2 jobs and by being in Bernice's memory essentially inexhaustible. Bernice sat with her for 2 hours. She did not tell her about the suspension. Her mother was 91 and had enough in her life that required her attention without adding this. They talked about her mother's neighbor who had recently taken up playing the harmonica and who practiced every evening at 6 o'clock, which was exactly when her mother's shows were on. They talked about the recipe for the sweet potato bread that Bernice had been trying to get right for 3 years, and that her mother had been making from memory for 60 years without ever measuring a single thing. They talked about Bernice's daughter and her 2 grandchildren, and the fact that the older grandchild, who was 7, had recently decided she wanted to be an astronaut. When Bernice was leaving, her mother held her hand for a moment longer than was usual. She looked at Bernice the way she had always looked at her when she thought something was being withheld with the particular attentiveness of a woman who had spent 60 years reading her children. She said, "You all right?" It was not a question the way she said it. Bernice said, "I'm fine, Mama." Her mother looked at her for another moment. Then she said, "You always were the one who handled things." Bernice said, "Where did I learn that?" Her mother said, "Not from me. I would have been louder about it." Bernice drove home. She sat at the kitchen table and went back to the inventory records. She thought about what her mother had said about handling things. She thought about the specific weight of handling a thing quietly when the inclination is to be loud, the discipline it requires, and what the discipline is for, and whether it was always right to apply it. She decided it was almost always right. The times it was not right, the situation made itself clear. Her daughter called at 7 in the evening and told her about the video. Bernice was quiet for a moment. She thought about 400 children sitting in silence with cold trays. She thought about Amara Jackson, who she remembered specifically because Amara always got the vegetable option and always said thank you and always brought her tray all the way to the drop-off station instead of leaving it at the table. She said they didn't have to do that. Her daughter said they did it anyway. She said, "I know." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I need to go. I have a hearing to prepare for." Dolores Reyes called the following morning at 9. She said, "I have the camera footage." Bernice said, and Dolores said, "It's clean." The cafeteria camera caught the whole thing. The hallway camera caught the handcuffing. Bernice said, "Does it match his report?" There was a pause. Dolores said no. "It does not match his report in any significant way." Bernice said, "Good." She thought about what her sergeant at Fort Benning had told her in her second year. He had said, "When you're in the right, Sergeant Hayes, you don't need to be loud about it. The facts will be loud enough. You just need to make sure the facts are in the room." She was going to make sure the facts were in the room. On the third day of Bernice's suspension, the video of the 400 children sitting in silence had been viewed by 600,000 people. A journalist from the city paper had contacted Dr. Moore and had published a story that included the inventory discrepancy figures, which were 0, and Webb's incident report, which described an aggressive and hostile encounter that the cafeteria footage did not support. 3 district board members had issued statements calling for the investigation to be reviewed. The superintendent's office had been unavailable for comment for 36 hours. Dolores Reyes called Bernice on day 3 to give her an update. She said the pension review has been quietly withdrawn. She said it the way you say something that you are glad about, but that should never have happened in the first place. Bernice said good. She paused, and then she said what was their basis for withdrawing it. Dolores said, "I asked the same question." Their response was that it was opened in error. Bernice said, "That's not what happened." Dolores said, "I know, but it's closed." Bernice said, "Then it's closed." She filed it under the category of things she knew and could not prove and would not pursue because the hearing was more important and she could only fight on one front at a time. On day 4, a national civil rights organization contacted Dolores Reyes to offer legal support. Dolores discussed this with Bernice. Bernice said, "I appreciate the offer. I would like to resolve this at the district level first. If that doesn't work, we'll talk about what else is available." Dolores said, "That's your call." Bernice said, "Yes, it is." On day 5, Bernice put on her good suit, the navy one she wore to interviews and hearings and the annual district budget presentation, and drove to the district administration building. The district review board hearing took place 5 days after the incident at 9 in the morning in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the district administration building. Present were the 3-member review board superintendent Halverson Dale Webb, with his police union representative Bernice Hayes, with Dolores Reyes, and Dr. Angela Moore, who had submitted a written statement, and who had also requested to speak in person. Bernice Hayes sat at the table on the left side of the room. She was wearing the navy suit. She had her inventory records in a folder in front of her, and she had her personal notes from the incident in a second folder, and she had in a third folder the written statements from Rosa Gutierrez and from Mr. Osei and from 3 parents who had been in the building that day and who had seen portions of the incident. She had organized the folders the night before in the order they would be needed. She was prepared. Webb presented his account first. He was confident. He spoke clearly. He described the report of missing supplies, his entry into the cafeteria, his questioning of Ms. Hayes, her hostility and failure to cooperate the necessity of detaining her for the integrity of the investigation. His police union representative had prepared him well, and his account was internally consistent, which was the particular quality of a fabricated account that has been constructed carefully. It cohered with itself even as it failed to cohere with reality. The review board chair, a woman named Patricia Lowe, who had been in district administration for 21 years, listened. She asked several questions about the specific report that had initiated the investigation. Webb said the report had come from a source he had not been at liberty to identify. She said a report about theft that you cannot document and cannot attribute to any named source. He said that's correct. She wrote something in her notes. Dolores Reyes requested that the camera footage from the cafeteria and hallway be played for the board. This was her right under the hearing procedure. Halverson's office had obtained the footage as part of the investigation record. The footage played on a monitor at the end of the conference table. The cafeteria camera had captured everything from above and to the side. The approach, the conversation at the service counter. Webb's movement behind the counter, the physical contact. The instruction to remove his hand, the non-compliance, the walk to the door. It had captured Bernice Hayes turning at the door and speaking to the children. It had captured the precise composure of someone who is being wronged and who has decided absolutely that she will not be broken by it. The hallway camera had captured the handcuffing. It had captured the timestamp 12:19. It had captured Bernice's request for her union representative. It had captured Webb's failure to acknowledge the request. The room was quiet while the footage ran. Webb's police union representative, a man named Terry Groff, who had been doing this work for 19 years, and who had seen what footage could do to a case, looked at the monitor, and then looked at his notes, and then looked at the monitor again. His expression did not change, but something in his posture changed in the way that a person's posture changes when the ground shifts under them. The cafeteria footage ran for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. It showed the approach, the conversation, the movement behind the counter, the physical contact, the instruction to remove the hand, the non-compliance. It showed Bernice Hayes' posture throughout level, controlled, unchanged. It showed her turning at the door and speaking to the children. The hallway footage showed the handcuffing. It showed the timestamp. It showed the exchange about the union representative. It showed the speed at which Webb walked Bernice Hayes toward the front of the building, which was not the speed of someone conducting an investigation. It was the speed of someone who wanted to be gone before anyone with authority arrived. Webb's police union representative had stopped writing in his notes by minute 2 of the footage. He sat with his pen on the table and watched the screen. His experience told him what the footage meant, and his experience was correct. When the footage ended, Patricia Lowe looked at Dale Webb for a long moment. She said, "Does this footage accurately represent the events as you described them?" He said, "There are angles it doesn't capture." She said, "What angles is it missing?" He was quiet. She said, "Mr. Webb, what aspects of your account does this footage fail to support?" He said, "I need to consult with my representative." She said, "You can do that after I've asked my questions." I'm asking now. Dr. Angela Moore, who had been sitting at the far end of the table with her written statement in front of her, looked at Dale Webb. She looked at him with the particular steady attention of someone who has waited for the truth to be in the room and who is now watching it arrive. Dr. Moore was called after the footage. She was measured specific and complete in her account. She described what she had seen when she came out of her office, what she had said, what Webb had said, and what she had done afterward. She described the cafeteria on the afternoon of the incident, the 400 cold trays, the silence, the children who had made a decision without being told to. She said, "I have been a principal for 7 years. I've never seen students organize themselves the way these students organized themselves." She said it without editorializing. She said it as a fact. She was asked whether she had encouraged the student protest. She said, "I did not encourage it, and I did not discourage it. I observed it." She was asked whether she thought it was appropriate. She looked at the review board chair and said, "I think it was honest." Bernice was given an opportunity to speak. She opened the first folder. She walked the board through the inventory records, 19 years column by column, the deliveries and the receipts and the cross-references to the district's purchasing records. She spoke for 11 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not digress. When she was finished, the board chair asked if there were any discrepancies in the records. Bernice said none. She asked at any point in the 19-year record. Bernice said none. She said it without emphasis because the inventory record said it without emphasis. The facts were in the room. The review board voted after 2 hours of deliberation to find the investigation unsubstantiated and to recommend Bernice Hayes' immediate reinstatement with full back pay. They also referred Webb's incident report to the district's legal team for review of potential false reporting and referred the 3 prior complaints to the district's independent oversight office for sequential review. The criminal investigation into Webb for filing a false report was opened by the City Police Department's Internal Affairs Division 4 days later. It would take 11 weeks to complete. At the end of those 11 weeks, Webb was charged with 1 count of filing a false official report and 1 count of official misconduct. He agreed to a plea, surrendered his law enforcement certification, and was permanently barred from working in any school district in the state. The 3 prior complaints against Webb were reviewed in sequence by the district's independent oversight office over the following 3 weeks. The custodian's complaint, read alongside the aide's complaint, read alongside the previous cafeteria manager's complaint. Read alongside Bernice Hayes' incident, they told a story that no single complaint told alone. The oversight office issued a formal finding that described a pattern of conduct targeting non-teaching, non-administrative black staff. The finding used the word pattern 7 times. It did not use any other descriptor. It did not need to. The 3 prior complaints had been available for sequential review for 18 months. No one had read them in sequence. The Oversight Office recommended a new procedure. All complaints involving the same officer would be reviewed together before any individual complaint was closed. The recommendation was adopted unanimously by the district board within 30 days. Dale Webb was terminated from his district position within 48 hours of the criminal charge. He entered a plea agreement 6 weeks after that. He surrendered his law enforcement certification permanently. He was barred from employment in any school district in the state. He was placed on 1 year of supervised probation. The pension review that had been quietly opened and quietly withdrawn left no record in the district's formal documentation. It had happened and been erased the way things that should not have happened are sometimes erased when they become too visible. Dolores Reyes filed a formal complaint about the pension review with the state's Labor Oversight Board. The complaint was pending. Bernice Hayes returned to Jefferson Elementary on a Monday morning. She drove to the school parking lot and sat in the car for 2 minutes. She was not collecting herself, she was already collected. She was simply sitting the way she sometimes sat at the start of something significant, giving the moment its due before moving into it. She had been here 19 years. She had been away for 5 days. The building looked exactly the same. The buses would arrive in 90 minutes. There were 400 children who needed to eat. She got out of the car and went to the kitchen, and she started the prep. She moved through the kitchen the same way she always moved through it, with economy, with purpose, with the particular attention that comes from understanding that every action has a downstream consequence. Rosa Gutierrez arrived at 6:45 and stopped in the doorway for a moment when she saw Bernice at the prep station. She said, "You're here." Bernice said, "I'm here." Rosa said, "Good." She tied on her apron and went to her station. The other 2 prep staff arrived at 7 and 7:15. When the last one came in and saw Bernice, she said nothing. She just went straight to work, which was the highest form of welcome the kitchen could produce, and which Bernice received as such. At 11:45, the first lunch wave began. Bernice stood at the service counter. Rosa Gutierrez was at the soup station where she always was. The bread rolls were in the warmers, which had been on since 6:30. The vegetable option was ready. The special of the week, a Caribbean rice preparation because the fourth graders were studying Caribbean history, was in the serving pan and warm and correct. The cafeteria filled with the noise of 400 children. At the head of the service line, wearing her hairnet and her apron and her 19 years, Bernice Hayes served lunch. She served it one tray at a time, the way she always had, knowing each child's name and most of their preferences and all of their restrictions. When Amara Jackson reached the front of the line, she looked up at Bernice Hayes and said, "Ms. Hayes, I'm glad you're back." Bernice looked at her. She thought about the video she had seen, 400 trays of cold food, 400 children in silence. She thought about the 5 days she had spent at her kitchen table building a case with inventory records and her own stubborn certainty that the truth properly documented would eventually be in the room. She said, "I'm glad to be back. How was the week?" Amara said, "Quiet." Bernice said, "I heard." She gave Amara the vegetable option, which was what Amara always chose, and she watched her carry her tray to the table near the window and sit down. The cafeteria was full and loud and warm and exactly what it was supposed to be. At 12:30 on the Monday of her return, one of the teachers who had tried to get the students to eat during the incident came to Bernice at the service counter and said, "What do you want me to tell them?" Bernice looked at her. She said, "Tell them thank you. Tell them I'll see them Monday." The teacher said, "Is that all?" Bernice said, "That's all they need." When she reached Amara Jackson's table, she stopped for a moment. Amara looked up at her. Bernice looked at Amara. The girl had organized 400 children to sit in silence for an entire lunch period without a single instruction from an adult. She had done it by the simple mechanism of making a choice and making it visible, and the children around her had understood what the choice meant and had made it with her. Bernice said, "I heard what you all did." Amara said, "We didn't want to eat without you." Bernice thought about this. She thought about the Army and the catering business and the 19 years and the interview committee and the USDA nutritional requirements she could recite from memory. She thought about the inventory records and the camera and the hearing and the 5 days at the kitchen table. She thought about all of it and what it added up to and whether the sum was what she had intended it to be. She said, "You didn't have to do that." Amara said, "I know, but we did." Bernice Hayes put the serving spoon down for a moment. She looked at the cafeteria, at the noise and the movement and the 400 trays of food that were being eaten today as they should be. She looked at the children and at Rosa at the soup station and at the camera on the far wall above the service counter, which had been running continuously for 4 years and would continue running. She thought about what her mother had said, "You always were the one who handled things." She picked up the spoon and went back to work. She served the rest of the line. She served the Caribbean rice to the fourth graders who were studying Caribbean history. She served the vegetable option to Amara Jackson. She served the soft preparation to the boy from first grade who no longer needed it. His dental surgery had been 6 months ago, and he had graduated to the regular menu, but who still chose the soft option sometimes out of habit, and she served it without comment because it was his choice, and it was within the options. She served 400 children, one, by name. 19 years of getting it right had not been erased in 5 days. What had been attempted in 5 days had made clear what 19 years had built, which was something that 400 children understood more completely than the people who had tried to take it away. Rosa Gutierrez's 17 seconds of footage had been given to Dolores Reyes the same day as the incident. Dolores had used it in the hearing alongside the camera footage. The board had watched both. Rosa had not been in the room for the hearing. She had gone to work every day of Bernice's suspension and had run the cafeteria service with the remaining staff, which she had done correctly, but which had required considerably more from her than her normal role, because Bernice was not there, and the difference was visible. But Dolores had conveyed to her afterward that the footage had been useful. Rosa had said good. She had gone back to her station. Mr. Osei had submitted a written statement. It described what he had seen in the hallway, the handcuffs, the request for the union representative, the failure to acknowledge the request. He had written it in 2 pages and had signed it and had given it to Dr. Moore, who had included it in the record. He had not told anyone else about the statement because it had not been a dramatic act. It had been the only reasonable act available to him given what he had witnessed and what he had chosen to do with it. The Oversight Office's new sequential review procedure went into effect district-wide within 60 days. The procedure required that all complaints involving the same staff member be read together before any individual complaint was closed. It was a 2-page document. It did not cite Bernice Hayes' case by name, but everyone who worked in the district knew which case had produced it. Dolores Reyes, who had been doing this work for 14 years and who had won many cases and lost some, said later that the Cafeteria case was the one that changed the most things per square foot of documentation. She said the camera, the inventory, the children, the prior complaints, Rosa's footage, Mr. Osei's statement, everything was already there. Everything had been there before Webb walked through that door. We just needed the right hearing to put it all in the same room at the same time in front of the right people. She said that's the lesson. Make sure the facts are in the room. Bernice Hayes has been making sure of that for 19 years. She didn't need anyone to rescue her. She needed the hearing. The facts did the rest. Amara Jackson went on to be student council president for 2 more years. In her 8th grade valedictorian address, which she delivered in the Jefferson Middle School gymnasium to an audience of 300 families, she talked about the lunch period in 5th grade. She said, "I learned that year that silence can be as loud as words if enough people choose it at the same moment for the right reason." She did not mention Ms. Hayes by name because she did not have to. Everyone in the room knew who she was talking about. Bernice Hayes had been making sure of that for 19 years. Some things are not destroyed by the attempt to destroy them. The attempt, when it fails, sometimes makes them larger. And the people who were present for it, Rosa Gutierrez, Mr. Osei, Dr. Moore, Amara Jackson, and 400 children who understood before anyone told them what was right, they carry it forward. They carry what they saw and what they chose and what it meant. That is what Bernice Hayes built. Not just a 91% participation rate, not just a cafeteria program, a room full of people who understood from watching her what it looked like to do the right thing without making noise about it. Subscribe our channel. We follow the people who get back to the kitchen and start the prep. Like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Comment your thoughts or similar experiences. Subscribe our channel. We follow the people who get back to the kitchen and start the prep. Like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Comment your thoughts or similar experiences.